Hello everyone and welcome. I apologize for not getting this video to you yesterday, Tuesday. It is the lecture that I delivered in class. However, when I got back to my office, there were some people in the hallway who were being extremely loud, and I tried to wake them out and they weren't gone after 45 minutes of waiting, so I just decided to come home and figured I would record the video when I had more time. On the bright side, what I am going to do is continue today's lecture, which will be Tuesday, and take you into Thursday's lecture. So you will not receive two lectures this week on video, you'll just receive the one. Yes, it may be twice as long, and you can take breaks whenever you want, obviously. But essentially, I'm going to cover Tuesday, which is really focused on Peter Ramus, and I'm going to focus on the second half, Thursdays, which is Francis Bacon. All right, so let's just dive right in. We know that Ramus is on the cusp of coming out of the medieval period, moving into the Renaissances. So some changes have started to be made in the world. I believe that I've said before that one of the things that starts to happen is that we see that rhetoric is in counterpoint to other things now. We know that for the classical Greeks, rhetoric and philosophy were kind of at odds. And we know that during the Roman period, rhetoric and power were at odds. During the medieval period, of course, it was rhetoric versus the church. As we move through the Renaissance periods and into the Enlightenment, one of the things you're going to see is this sort of tension between rhetoric, reasoning, and the aesthetic. Now, reasoning here, I'm using that term because that's the term that they used back then, literally meaning science, okay? The things that we call science today. Going out and empirically finding answers to questions we have about the world in our lives is reasoning to them. And it makes sense if you think about it, that you get this data and then you reason from that to make a claim. So they called it reasoning. I will call it reasoning. It is science/reasoning. The aesthetic, of course, is the artistic, the things that are beautiful. Hopefully I'm rehashing what I gave you guys in your last lecture. So we know that that's the position that we're in, and we also know one other thing, that the church is not going to be the supreme ruler of knowledge forever. We're starting to see that slow down. One of the reasons why is not just because humans started asking different questions, although that's part of it, but also because the humanists, that is the people who did not necessarily believe that humans were better or bigger than God or any other supreme being, but just that humans can ask and answer questions about the world in which they live. The idea of empiricism becomes very popular. And even though Peter Ramus is going to have a very strong Christian church background, he's the one who starts to divide rhetoric up and chop it up in pieces and make life difficult for us even today. The definition of rhetoric as flowery language, empty, lying, whatever sort of terms you've heard along those lines for defining rhetoric, all come from Peter Ramus. Okay, so up until now, you know that we have been with these theorists who define rhetoric as a well-reasoned argument processed and publicly delivered for the purpose of persuasion. We know that. Peter Ramus is going to destroy that. So let's talk about him. He's fun to talk about. One of the reasons why he's fun to talk about is because some of his things, I read it and I'm just like, how can you be this dumb? But of course, that's one of the reasons to read it, is just to understand how not to make these arguments, right? So Ramus comes along and he says, all right, look, there's issues here, okay? Ramus was a teacher. He wanted to be a teacher of rhetoric, and apparently he thought the best way to become a teacher in rhetoric was to destroy all of the foundational principles that we know about rhetoric up until this point. So, of course, the first person he has to attack is going to be Aristotle. The second main attack that he has is on Quintilian. Okay, so he takes two of the founding fathers, if we want to put it that way, or foundational theorists, and says they're wrong. Now, we're going to talk about why they're wrong. Aristotle is wrong because his syllogisms don't make sense. Now, this is fascinating, but I would understand completely if you don't want to take the time to dig into this. In fact, I think I told you in the syllabus to just skim this reading. But one of the things you would find if you dug into this a little bit was that in order to prove that syllogisms don't work, Ramus writes a syllogism. And what's sort of humorous about it, I guess, is that the first premise, the major premise, is not something we all agree on or know. So it's an inaccurately constructed syllogism, first of all, which, secondly, may mean that it is just inaccurate overall. I mean, if we don't all agree on the major premise, it's going to be kind of hard to apply that to a minor premise. So whenever I've read Ramus's critique of Aristotle, particularly in this syllogistic form, I'm kind of like, well, you just failed at the thing you were trying to prove was true. And it's sort of funny. And I wouldn't encourage you to read that for fun necessarily, but just know that he attacked the syllogism and said that Aristotle was wrong. One of the reasons why he was wrong, by the way, was because you knew the conclusion before you started the proof. And that is actually true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Aristotle is just wrong about rhetoric in the whole, okay, on the whole. So he also, in attacking some of these foundational principles, obviously is attacking the role that rhetoric plays. If it's not for the purpose of reasoning, then what is its purpose? And we're going to get to that in a second. So the second theorist that he really attacks foundationally is Quintilian. Now, Quintilian defines a great orator or rhetoric as a good person who is speaking well. And what he does here is he says it's not just about speaking well, and it's not just about making the right arguments. It's not just about those things, but it's also about being a good person. Now, if you'll recall, Aristotle also had said that a speaker should have goodwill towards their audience. So this doesn't seem that far off track. When you read Quintilian, you're kind of like, well, yeah, that makes sense. You know, you have to be a good person to practice rhetoric. And Aristotle told Plato, and Quintilian told the people of Rome, if you're not a good person, if you don't have goodwill towards your audience, you're no longer practicing rhetoric. So if you're up there using rhetorical devices and you're being deceitful, or you're only giving partial information or inaccurate on purpose or accidentally, whichever way that happens, then you are not practicing rhetoric at all. That is just lying or persuasion or coercion. But it is not rhetoric, which is an art that requires that there be an ethic to it. Okay? And a lot of people, I guess, had problems with that. No, I take that back. Ramus had a problem with that and said that here's the reason why he's really angry. Because Quintilian's definition is overly broad. Okay? Ramus says that Quintilian's definition explodes the definition of rhetoric too far. And he uses a couple of examples for this. I don't remember exactly which arts he chose, so I'm going to choose my own, but the argument's the same. If we all were artists, right, that doesn't mean we all do exactly the same thing. Not all of us are oil painters. Not all of us are poets. Not all of us write novels. Not all of us dance. Not all of us act or perform in a different way. We're not all the same, but we may fall under that term art, right? However, if I am a painter, an oil painter, for example, and you are a dancer, would we evaluate my paintings with the same standards that we would evaluate your dancing? And the answer to that, of course, is no. So Aristotle says that if we're going to evaluate rhetoric based on who the person is, then that is too much to ask. That is like evaluating them for things other than what's in the art of rhetoric. Now, to some extent, I see that argument making some sense. I'm just not really sure what the point of it is. Because just because we're adding that you need to be a good person to practice rhetoric, well, how is that any different from saying that you have to have good balance if you're a dancer? Or you need to have control of instruments if you're going to be a painter? So these kinds of things, to me, this argument makes no sense to me at all whatsoever, in that it doesn't tell us anything new. But for your purposes, for the purposes of this course, know this: Ramus says that Quintilian, by including that ethical part about being a good person, overbroadened the definition of rhetoric. Therefore, Ramus also postulates that God, he says, or any other higher being, whatever we want to use here, he uses the word God. God has given people two gifts: the power of speech and the power of reasoning. Okay? Our power of speech and our power of reasoning are not the same things. He says they're two separate gifts from God. Therefore, they should remain separate. They are not to be the same. And rhetoric, with its 5 canons, pushes them all together, mushes it together. And that's bad, because it's confusing and it's difficult to become an expert at something that is that broad. Personally, I think it's just that Ramus couldn't become an expert at something that broad. I think the rest of us have kind of like figured that out. It's not that hard. Even you at this point, I would say, have probably figured this out. To have 5 basic rules seems to make sense. Like, that seems, legitimate. I see it no differently than a baseball game. You have a first, a second, and a third base. You have a batter lineup. You've got a catcher. You've got specified positions that do specified jobs. And already I'm beyond 5 canons of playing softball or baseball, right? So 5 canons of rhetoric doesn't seem like that much, but it was too much for Ramus. So he divided them. And he said that our reasoning, the gift of reasoning that we've gotten from God, is invention and arrangement. Excuse me. Invention and arrangement belong to the realm of reasoning. The gift of speech, on the other hand, it is where we put style and delivery. Now, memory, it's been debated about where Ramus really intended that to be. It's totally unimportant, so let's not worry about that. I usually put it on the side of speech because it makes sense to me that rehearsing the tradition of speaking would go under speaking. So if you want all 5 of them divided, then I would say that speaking, the gift of speaking, which he's going to call rhetoric, is only style, memory, and delivery. Rhetoric does not include, then, reasoning, which is a separate gift that we've been given, which I'm assuming he means like a talent or a skill or something we can develop. Reasoning is where you come up with your topic, you determine your proofs, you find your evidence. That is the scientific process of perhaps eventually speech making, but not until you get there. Now, this is an incredibly simplistic way to look at 2 concepts. One, dialectic, to say that it's just invention and arrangement together, that's dialectic, and rhetoric, it's just delivery of a speech. That really does pull apart sort of what I call a synergistic effect, right? The sum is greater, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You don't just take 2 things, put them together, and they happen to occur together. But that when you put reasoning with rhetoric, you get something else, which is to say that you get a more persuasive, ethical speech, okay? And knowledge. The sharing of knowledge at that point becomes well-reasoned as well as well-spoken. So for me, dividing these 5 canons up just makes literally no sense. I can't imagine delivering a speech without invention and arrangement being a core part of how I came to deliver that speech, if that makes sense. And I can't imagine going through the process of dialectic and saying, oh, look at this cool thing I just learned. I'm never telling anybody. I'm not going to share that. I might tell a student or something. I mean, that's silly, right? Because the idea of communicating the reasoning is to share knowledge. And of course, Ramus, remember, was still trying to preserve that God was at the head of all knowledge. And so I'm sure part of that fed into it. But the truth of the matter is that he was banished from teaching and literally run out of town on a rail. I believe it was the St. Bartholomew Massacre, where he was basically just ripped from his office and murdered, however that happened. So he was a rabble-rouser. He definitely liked causing trouble. I like to think that I like to cause trouble, but I hope that I do it for the right reasons. In the case of Ramus here, he does give us something of a foil, right? He gives us sort of that antithesis, that counterpoint that we need to truly understand why the 5 canons together make up an art or skill of knowing in a particular instance all the means of persuasion. Okay, so that's how he, in my humble opinion, helps us out. Okay, if you have any questions about Ramus, please feel free to let me know. If you ever want to try to imagine what Ramus was like, here's what I told the students on Tuesday. If you've seen the movie The Princess Bride, which I'm finding far fewer of my students have, but some of you still have watched it. If you haven't, go watch it. It's worth your time. The Princess Bride, in there we have the man in black who is trying to steal back the princess from Vizzini. And Vizzini says, well, you've beat my swordsman, so I clearly can't fight you. And you beat my giant, even though you're tiny, so I can't beat you there. So we're going to have a battle of wits. And the man in black says, okay, are you sure you want to have a battle of wits with me? Do you think you could do that? And Vizzini says, have you ever heard of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates? And the man in black says, yes. And he goes, morons. And that's how I see Peter Ramus, that he's kind of looking at Aristotle, Quintilian, and going, you're morons. Now, of course, I don't buy that. And I don't think I'm in the minority here, because obviously who won out in the end is not Peter Ramus or anybody not Peter Ramus, but instead is a division in how people treated and viewed rhetoric, and how rhetoric was treated in the educational system as it was developed through the Renaissances. So we end up with this sort of triumvirate of tension, right, between rhetoric, reasoning, and the aesthetic. And it's all thanks to Mr. Peter Ramus. When I have a whiteboard in front of me, I'm able to draw sort of a timeline of how this happens. But essentially, the timeline that we've been working with, going all the way back to the Greeks, that has been unified this whole time, branches off into 3 areas. We really have rhetoric, we have reasoning, and we have the aesthetic. We start to encounter problems like, can a poem, the aesthetic, make an argument, rhetorical, and reason? Is there something in our scientific study that requires us to understand rhetoric? We now call this study, by the way, the rhetoric of science. These are the questions that are going to come up over the course of the next several theorists that we're going to be reading, and that starts with Sir Francis Bacon. So let's move on to Francis Bacon. First of all, probably something, I don't know if it's true or not, somebody needs to look this up for me, but I heard a theory that Sir Francis Bacon, his mother's maiden name, which they often took back then, his mother's maiden name was Cook. So his name was actually Sir Francis Cook Bacon, and I hope that's true. That just makes me happy. So let's keep in mind that there are 2 Francis Bacons out there in our history. This is Frances, and he was a pretty well-known scientist. And I say scientist because he developed something known as the Baconian method of study. So I have you read 2 pieces from Bacon. Now, what you need to know is that he was in jail a few times for not paying his bills. This was back when we jailed debtors. And he lived a life on the edge of poverty a great deal. He had other times of great success. So he sort of had this roller coaster life. But the 2 pieces, and he's written more than this, by the way, but the 2 pieces that I think I had you read or look through are Novum Organum and what was the other one? Oh, Faculty Psychology, I believe, are the 2 I have you read, I think. So in Faculty Psychology, what he's talking about is the original starts for how we ended up with lobotomies, to be honest with you. I mean, lobotomies were not his fault. But this idea that you could break the brain up and divide it. So we have like little pieces of information and knowledge and skills that we're born with that are in parts of our brain. Now, I don't think there's too much of a debate that when we're trying to use short-term memory, that it's somewhere up in this area of our brain under our skull, right? We know that. We know that motion is from the back of the brain. And we know that there's certain parts of the brain that are related to certain tasks and activities and talents that we have. So he believed the brain could be divided up like that. In addition, our brain comes with certain faculties, certain talents and skills that we're born with. Now, I will tell you without fail that I can't do math, that I was not there on the day that math was handed out to the human race. I just missed it. And my nephew, who is he's becoming an up-and-coming known, what do they call those things, actuary, tells me, Aunt Beth, you could learn math. Anybody can learn math. And I just look at him and go, I don't understand numbers. In this case, Bacon would be saying that I was born without the faculty for numbers, and therefore, no matter how much I study them, I will never be great at using them. All right? Whereas my nephew, God love him, was clearly born with a math gene of some kind, but definitely a faculty for it in his brain that he has honed over his time in his studies. Can't speak to save his life. The guy communicates like a badger. I mean, sometimes I'm talking to him and I'm like, son, let's try this a little differently. And it's not a bad thing. It's just something he doesn't have a great talent for. Public speaking, according to most people, is a talent that either you're born with or that you don't have. Personally, I believe we're all born with some level of talent for these things. Yes, math included. But that our brains work on different faculties better than others. For me, the faculty of rhetoric, which is what Bacon would say that rhetoric is, it's a faculty. It's something that we have, hopefully that we're born with, that we can hone, and a skill we can further develop, a talent that we can work on, but not everybody has it. So that's what the concept of faculty psychology is. And if we think about the brain that way, what we're really saying is that rhetoric is something that can be something present in you that you utilize, or it could be completely absent from your brain. what Francis Bacon did not do in this piece, in this particular work, was to help us understand what parts of rhetoric are not talents or faculties, because some people are very, very good at writing speeches, terrible at delivering them. Other people are really, really terrible at writing speeches, fantastic at delivering them. And we don't really get that breakdown from Bacon. And I think it's because for Bacon, he really was trying to find out the science behind some of our talents, the way that we think. And the Baconian method that he created is almost the exact inverse of what we now call the scientific method. I don't want to confuse you too much. For me, these are the same thing, but let me explain to you the difference academically speaking. So in the traditional model of scientific study, it's deductive, right? We make a generalized hypothesis, and then we set about proving that hypothesis to be true or untrue based on a series of examples. That's the basic deductive way that we do science, okay? And we call that the scientific method. Prior to that being our way of thinking, proving or disproving hypotheses, we did things a little bit differently. We did them inductively. We would go and we would have a bunch of experiences and then draw conclusions from that. So the inductive way of doing science. This was called the Baconian method for science. So you have the Baconian method, inductive, the scientific method, deductive. And in fact, this is probably somewhat important to know how Bacon died, which is less ironic than it sounds. Apparently, he was doing studies of how to freeze farm fowl to preserve its meat. And he was going out and using snow, because they didn't have ice back then, ice machines or anything. And he went out and was packing these chickens, or they probably weren't chickens. They were probably like geese or something along those lines. And he was packing them in the snow and testing them out, and he caught pneumonia and he died. So, I mean, a tragic end, but someone who died doing what they loved, practicing science in the way that they wanted to practice science. So then the question becomes then, if that's the case, what is this crazy thing that he writes called the Novum Organum? Novum Organum literally means new instrument, okay? And we need to recall that Bacon, through his methods, was trying to find truth, a big T truth through empirical methods. That is, sight, taste, smell, feel, etc. So he was looking for the truth. The Novum Organum is a new instrument for understanding how we come to truth. So I need you to absorb that for a second. The Novum Organum is a new instrument for how we come to determine the truth. All right? Apologies. Just a few things from COVID still coming up periodically. So, Novum Organum is a list, essentially, a definition of, and the warnings of what he calls 4 idols, IDOLS. Reading these 2 pieces should not be difficult. He writes very clearly and they're short. But in these 4 idols, he calls them idols because they distract us from the truth. They are the things that make it harder for us to find and to see the truth empirically. All right? So that's the way to think about these. These 4 idols are distractions from the truth. So whenever I'm seeking the truth, these 4 things, these 4 concepts are always making my hunt for the truth, it's modifying my hunt for the truth. It's impacting my hunt for the truth. It's going to impact the way I come to my conclusions and the way that I explain my conclusions. Okay, what are the 4 idols? The first idol is the idol of the cave, or sometimes called the idol of the den. Now again, this is IDOL, like a little toy idol or something like that. The idol of the cave or of the den is our own being. We are individuals who like to go into our caves and see the world the way that we have created the world to be. So right now I'm in my room that is my office. My office is always my cave. No matter where it is, I have my books. I have some things that make me feel good about me. I like to pretend I'm very important and academic and artsy and all these other things, but it's all about me. And when I sit in this room, in my cave space, I am only thinking from my own perspective and nothing else. So in order to get beyond this idol, I have to get outside of myself to find the truth. The second idol, the idol of the tribe, is humanity. We are in fact human, which gives us certain limitations. We are limited in time, space. We are limited in what resources we have to work with. We are limited in how much knowledge we can gain, on where that knowledge comes from. I'm limited in what I can see. I'm only going to be able to see so much at one time, to smell so much at one time, to be able to hear sounds so much and be able to distinguish them differently. That's just the nature of being human. So we have to keep in mind not only that we're in our own perspective, but that as humans, we don't know everything at any given moment. So I can tell you that my room that I'm sitting in is painted dark gray, light gray, and white. And I'm telling you that because I painted it, right? And I'm able to see with my eyes what is in front of me, right? And you're able to see some of that on the video screen, right? Great. What aren't we seeing? Well, from this perspective, we're not seeing what color the ceiling is, what color the desk is, what color the light fixtures are, what the curtains look like. We're not seeing the whole room because we're only shown a part of it based on our eyesight and based on the equipment that we're using too, to be honest with you. But based on the fact that we are human, we can only see so much. I can't see outside right now. So we have to keep in mind the limitations that we are human when we're searching for the truth. The third one is the idol of the theater. This is your culture, our culture, and your culture. So obviously I'm a big mashup mix of my family's culture, where I was raised, that culture, how I was raised, that culture, where I went to school in those cultures, the culture I'm in right now, the subcultures that I've belonged to, the ones I've identified with and the ones I no longer identify with, and so on. So in where I come from, my family, we're very tied to our ethnic cultures as well. So my Christmas Eve dinner is very different from almost everyone that I know, unless their families are tied to the ethnicity of Middle Europe. Okay, so if you're German, Czech, Hungarian, Ukrainian, let's see, it would be Eastern Russia, that area, then you might be familiar with some of the traditions of that culture. If you're not, then you won't be. Well, that's just a difference in our cultural backgrounds and experiences, but those cultural experiences and the ones that occur now, the ones we live in, impact our search for the truth. and will change how we experience things empirically. Okay? It's important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about drawing conclusions from things that we find or proving hypotheses. We have to make sure that we take into consideration cultural, like, sort of implications of that. Last but not least, the idol of the marketplace. The marketplace is a big stock exchange, right? It's where we trade with whatever currency we have. The currency of the realm in this case is language, the words that we have, the symbols that we use. So if that's the currency, we have to know that that currency is limited. It might be limited in the sense of, like, we speak different languages. Of course, that's a limitation. But it also might be that we're limited because one word can't cover everything. Because one word can have many meanings. Because I can call this gray behind me and you're going to say, it looks a little bit more blue-purple to me, right? All of those things, all of those words, the descriptors that we have, the symbols that we use, the symbols we choose to use to represent things impact our search for the truth. So, do these 4 idols mean that we can never find the truth empirically? No. Bacon is merely saying that in order to understand what we are seeking when we seek the truth and what we're empirically experiencing, we must take into consideration the pitfalls of those 4 idols. All right? Hopefully that makes sense to you. I'm going to end it there because this video's gone on a little too long for my liking, and I'm sure for yours. But if you have any questions, let me know. If I do something different tomorrow in the classroom that I think might be helpful, I will certainly let you know that. Otherwise, this should cover you for the week, and I'll look forward to seeing you all soon. Have a good weekend.